ceachtadála Níl Sean Shaw, so I ceachtar Jennifer Carl McNeil.
Corla, to ask the Minister about the opportunity to roll out programmes in higher education for students with intellectual disability, recognising that only 1% of people with intellectual disability have the opportunity so far to go to university and to get a statement on progress.
Thanks very much to Deputy Cara McNeil, and thanks for all her work and interest and engagement with me on this issue. I'm really pleased that the allocation we got yesterday in the budget for the National Access Plan specifically references students with intellectual disabilities, because we've made a lot of progress as a country and we've more to do in relation to a number of disabilities, but based on the figures you've said there, we've got a long way to go in relation to intellectual disabilities, and I'm determined that we make progress on this, and our new National Access Plan will for the first time include the issue of intellectual disabilities as well as a broader range of disabilities too. Inclusion is one of the core strategic goals for my department, and my ambition is to ensure that we provide supports and opportunities for learning for all. And this means responding to the needs of different learners, vulnerable learners, people who are more marginalised and people with special and additional needs. And this means assisting people in accessing and progressing through higher and further education and training. For higher education, these aims will be reflected, as I've said, in our new National Access and Inclusion Plan. This will be published over the coming months, hopefully by the end of the year. And I've recently announced 5 performance funding awards totalling €5 million in the higher education sector. This included €1 million in funding for UCC's inclusive education pathways for students with intellectual disabilities. This award is based on innovative programmes that support inclusive education pathways for students with intellectual disabilities. I've referenced the €5 million we secured yesterday as part of Budget 2022, and that specifically talks about, and this is important, a dedicated pilot called a Pathways Project in higher education for students with intellectual disabilities. So how do we've made a lot of progress at primary level, at secondary level. How do we make sure the cliff edge hasn't just moved to the end of secondary level? So working with Minister Madigan, Minister Rabbitt, Minister O'Gorman, to put in place a pathway project to help students with intellectual disabilities transition from second level education on to further education or higher education. We've been engaging extensively with learners, with their advocates, with a number of representative bodies, and my intention is to hold a roundtable with learners, stakeholders and institutions to hear their views on how best to use this funding in terms of these pathway projects, and I'll be doing that in the coming weeks as well. I do want to also acknowledge the really good work that's been going on in the Trinity Centre for People with Intellectual Disabilities, and thank you for introducing me to that work. I think it is a model of best practice, and I'm also looking at how we can expand that, but also encourage other institutions to do likewise, because I think it's quite magic what's going on there.
Thank him for meeting the Trinity Centre for People with Intellectual Disabilities, which of course, university is not for every person with or without intellectual disabilities, but it should be an option. And the dignity that it gives to be properly included, to have a student card, to be able to be on the Frisbee team or whatever it happens to be that a young person chooses, to be properly included and to be given the confidence. I met a young man who was a graduate of that centre over the weekend, who now has a full-time permanent position in a commercial firm in Dublin, who has worked through the pandemic in his own way, and who is now a board member of Inclusion Ireland as a self-advocate, and the confidence that those programmes give because of the inclusion and dignity that they give to young people, and giving the opportunity, instead of being assumed that it's okay to be sent to daycare or something of that nature, to be given the opportunity for work in commercial companies as same as everybody else, to have a lanyard the same as everybody else, to pay tax the same as everybody else, to have the dignity of grumbling on a Monday morning, getting on a bus the same as everybody else. That is what real inclusion is, and we must conceive intellectual disability in the same way as everything else. I thank you for your work so far, Minister. You might just respond to those points.
Yeah, look, the Deputy is 100% correct. I remember from my time in health, every year there'd be a discussion around school leavers. And I remember finding it slightly insulting, because the discussion was around what are we going to do about a daycare place or a respite place. These are really important things, really important, and we need to do more on them. But it's not the totality. At the time, other children were talking to their parents about what they were going to do next. We seemed to think our only responsibility as a state was to provide the health service piece, and we didn't always get that right either. We need to now talk directly to the students at an early stage in second level as to what they want to do when they leave, and put the supports in place. I had a really, really good meeting with Down Syndrome Ireland, but I remember one of the mothers, and I'll always remember this, she said to me, you've no idea how hard it is. She said, not only do I not watch my child progress when they leave school, I'm actually watching them regress. And that's a disgrace, and it's a shame on all of us as a collective. And I'm determined, if my department does nothing else, to apply a real focus to this. We have a lot of good things going on in terms of a fund for students with disabilities, good supports, good examples in terms of Trinity, but they're still examples. It needs to be embedded. And you're right, it's not just higher education. It could be further ed, it could be training, it could be higher ed. It's about the same diversity of choice. So €5 million, let's get on now with a number of projects. led by learners and grounded in what the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities says.
I couldn't agree more, Minister, and the point that you make about regression is particularly appropriate. I remember one graduate from the Centre for Trinity, for Centre for People with Intellectual Disabilities, who didn't have a job to go to, and so she went back to a daycare facility, and she, by the time her graduation came, she didn't have the confidence to stand up from her seat to go to get her certificate. That's the scale of regression that is possible. We need to work with Irish business, who have been so responsive to this, and it is inclusive for everybody in working in Irish business to see somebody with intellectual disabilities on the reception desk, at the forefront, working in HR, working in meaningful, real jobs that are part of the organisation, instead of regressing. This is about empowering those people who choose to go to university. The Trinity Centre for People with Intellectual Disabilities is a particularly strong model. It's a gold star, and as you say, the real challenge is to broaden that around all of the other universities and to make that accessible irrespective of what part of the country that you're in, that these are viable options so that parents of young people with intellectual disabilities aren't frightened of that day when they cease to have the learning supports around them that help them continue to progress. Thank you for your work on it, Minister.